Hi, everyone. How are you? Good. So you saw that little bit of an intro there. Originally started as a neuroscientist, a brief foray into auto racing, and then I ended up in finance. And basically, I tell people that I just can't hold down a job. It's my MO. I just jump from thing to thing to thing. And in fact, I can't even stick to the presentation. In your program, it says I'm going to be talking about how financial literacy is the, what is it? I don't even remember what it was. It's the corrective lens of personal finance. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about something else. That's me. Just get used to it. Debt used to be a four-letter word. I mean, technically, it's still a four-letter word, but I mean, it used to be a four-letter word. You go back far enough in history, and if you borrowed money to buy something that depreciated, that went down in value, people would look at you funny. Today, debt is everywhere. It's so normal that if you tell people that you don't carry a balance on your credit card, you're the weird one. Okay? We need to start hating debt again. That's my contention today. And I'm talking about debt with respect to buying depreciating assets. I'm not talking about your mortgage or your student loans. Those are okay in most circumstances, but that's not what I'm talking about. Borrowing to buy stuff that goes down in value. We need to start hating that again. I had an aha moment a few months ago with respect to my personal health. And let me explain. So, as I mentioned in the video, we all know what we have to do to have better health. You have to work out and you have to eat well. But I was surfing the internet and I came across this statistic. The average heart will beat 2.5 billion times in a lifetime. And for whatever reason, this simple little tidbit of information really struck a chord with me. And I thought to myself, okay, this means something to me about my health. And there's a little calculator that said, plug in your age and your resting heart rate, and I'll tell you when you're going to die. And then I realized, okay, so if I lower my heart rate, I'll get a few extra months. If I lower it by 4 beats, maybe I'll get a few extra years and I'll have a better quality of life. And so that struck a chord with me, and I started to look at my health in a totally different way. Even though I knew all this other stuff about health and that you're supposed to do these things, but I wasn't doing it. I wasn't paying attention to it. So that was my aha moment, and it was a perspective shift. Okay, and that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about a perspective shift with the way people look at money. And so let's start by looking at the current perspective, a current perspective that a lot of people look at, which may not work for everyone. So let me explain what this perspective is. Let's take a look, using an analogy of the number of heartbeats over the course of a lifetime. Let's look at the total income over a working career. And you don't have to memorize any of these numbers. This is all big picture stuff. I'm just trying to explain the current perspective, so don't worry about the detail I'm about to go into. Let's say we start with a couple. They both earn $25,000 after tax, and they're going to have an increase in salary by 4% per year until the time they turn 65. By that time, that salary increase will translate into a household after-tax income of $316,000. That's a lot of money, right? But the problem with looking at dollar values far off in the future is that we can't appreciate the value of inflation or the impact of inflation. And here's a little piece of information that's, I think, will explain the power of inflation. Ask anyone who's 65 or older what they paid for their first house and what they paid for their last car. And I'm willing to bet that 8 times out of 10, they paid more for their last car. I'll give you a real-life example. I called my father earlier this week. I said, hey, Pop, what'd you pay for your first house? $34,000. And it wasn't a cardboard box. $34,000 for their first house, and I know that the last car that they bought was more than $34,000. So that's the power of inflation. So you need to factor it in whenever you're looking at long-term dollar values. So let's do that. This is the same chart, and now we've adjusted for inflation. I used a 3% rate. And again, these projection numbers, they're not that important. I'm just explaining the overall perspective. But what it tells you is that $315,000 when this couple turns 65 is going to buy you $80,000 worth of today's stuff. Okay? So that's a real increase of 1% per year for this couple's income. And some people might be saying that I'm being generous with that because income have been stagnating in North America for a long time. But let's just go with this. Now, whenever you look at incomes, let's add them all up. So if you add up every year of income on that chart, that's $3 million in today's dollars. That's a lot of potential, isn't it? $3 million. If people are further along that chart, you're in your 50s and 60s, think about how much money you've made in your lifetime and how much of that has been converted into real net worth. For some people, that might be a bit of a sobering exercise. Right? So there's a lot of potential there. $3 million over the course of a lifetime. 2.5 billion heartbeats over the course of a lifetime. Now, whenever you look at income, you have to look at expenses. And people are funny. You give them $10, they have a tendency to spend exactly $10. You walk into a bank, and they do the calculation, and they say, based on your financials, you can afford to buy a house worth $450,000. They will go out and buy a house worth $450,000. They don't pull back on the reins at all. You give them a dollar, they spend a dollar. So as this couple's income rises, their expenses rise as well. Now let's fast forward to retirement. Two things happen. Your expenses and your incomes drop. I'm going to assume that government benefits, Social Security is going to cover a quarter of your pre-retirement income. I'm going to assume that your expenses drop by 50% because you're entering retirement debt-free, which is a big assumption. More and more people are entering retirement with debt. So again, I'm being generous here, but what you can see is that there's a shortfall in retirement, right? Your expenses are more than your income. And we looked at the total amount of income that you earn over the course of a lifetime. Let's look at the total amount of expenses you have over the course of a lifetime. So it's $4 million. $3 million in income, $4 million in expense over the course of your lifetime, not counting in the government benefits in retirement. So what's this current perspective? The current perspective with respect to money management, teaching people about the importance of it, is that you need to save up so that eventually you can pay for that shortfall in retirement. That's one of the current perspectives, right? Run a budget, run a surplus, invest the surplus, earn interest, have that interest grow so it covers that shortfall in retirement. That is the current perspective, or a current perspective that, quite frankly, doesn't work for a lot of people because they don't do it. It means they're not buying into it. It doesn't resonate with them. So maybe it's time for a perspective shift or a different perspective because, again, debt is more ubiquitous. So instead of looking at the power of how interest can work for you by compounding and growing it over time, maybe some people should be looking at the evils of paying interest. And let's quantify that. Consider this statement. When you walk into a bank, it's not the bank that's really lending you money. You're borrowing money from your future self. Does that make sense? Let's go back to our chart here and examine this 18-year-old couple. They walk into a bank and they say, I would like to buy a $35,000 car, but I just started working. I don't have $35,000. I have to pay for my living expenses. But I'm willing to pay you a fee in the form of interest in exchange for you letting me spend my future income today. That's the way you should look at things. And speaking of cars, does a $35,000 car actually cost $35,000? Well, a 5-year car loan used to be normal. These days, it's not unusual to see 7-year car loans. And let's assume this person gets this $35,000 loan for 7 years, and let's say the interest rate is 6%. That's going to work out to $43,000. Now, had you saved up ahead of time, with today's low interest rate environment, you're going to have to save $34,000. You're going to get maybe $1,000 worth of growth, and you can save up ahead of time to pay for that $35,000 car. So $34,000 versus $43,000 for the exact same car. It's a $9,000 difference. The average person will own 9 cars over the course of their lifetime. If both people in this household drive, that's 18 cars. 18 cars times $9,000. If you're perpetually borrowing money and financing and leasing a car, it's $162,000 in interest just for spending your future income earlier. Let's change gears. Let's talk about credit card debt. I just mentioned the word credit card debt, and people are like, ooh. If you ask any personal finance guru out there, they're going to tell you that the cornerstone of personal financial management is running a budget. A balanced budget, or ideally a surplus budget. You take the surplus, you invest it for the shortfall. Funny thing happens when you give someone a credit card. Remember when you give someone $10, they'll spend $10? You give them credit, which is just access to their future income, they spend it. So you give someone a $5,000 balance on a credit card or a credit limit, they will find a way to spend that $5,000. Not everyone, but a lot of people. What that means is that they were really bad at budgeting because they were overspending until they got to their credit limit. And then a magical thing happens. They run a balanced budget after that, but only because they couldn't get more credit, right? So not running more and more debt because now they're budgeting. So it wasn't important before. No one was sort of looking at saying, you shouldn't be overspending. Here's $5,000 of your future income if you want access to it, and they use it. And then after that, they carry it in perpetuity. A lot of people carry a balance in perpetuity on their credit cards. Think about that. So they overspend, they're bad with budgeting, then they run a balanced budget. So the debt gets to $5,000, and it just stays there. Every now and then, they'll put a little bit of a dent into that balance on the credit card, but then 2 months later, there's some emergency, right? And the balance goes right back up to the credit limit. Do you want to guess what the cost of interest is from 18 to 65 if you carried a balance of $5,000? $70,000 in credit card interest just by carrying $5,000, just by overspending once and then managing a balanced budget. Right? You shifted your income once by $5,000, then you ran a balanced budget. Cost you $70,000 in interest to do that. And some people might say, well, not everyone carries $5,000 in credit card balance, and you're right. According to the Federal Reserve, in November of 2012, the average American household that had credit card debt had $15,000 worth of it. Do the math on that. It's over $200,000 in interest if they carry it in perpetuity. And that's assuming they pay it off when they turn 65. So we looked at perspectives. For me, when I looked at health from the perspective of the number of beats over the course of a lifetime, that made a difference to me. There are a lot of people right now, when they look at the current perspective or a current perspective of the deficit in retirement and how you need to save up for it, it doesn't resonate with them. Maybe another perspective that we should be looking at so that we start hating debt again is what's the total amount of interest we pay over the course of our lifetimes for stuff that isn't worth anything anymore. And so I have a challenge for people. If you're older, go back and look at all the car loans you've had, all the credit card debt that you've carried, estimate it, figure out the percent interest you paid on all those things, and figure out how much interest you've paid over the course of your lifetime for depreciating assets. If you're young, maybe create a mini financial plan. See, well, I want a car in a few years. I'm thinking about spending X. Go to an online calculator. Figure out how much interest you're going to pay, how long the loan is going to be. Figure out how much interest you're going to pay with that little plan. Now, once you've figured out how much interest you're going to pay in your working career, divide that by your after-tax income. And you know what you're going to find out? If you're like this couple that carried $5,000 in credit card debt and always financed or leased their vehicles, one person had to work 8 years just to pay the interest for shifting their income early. Reflect on this statement. Think of borrowing money today as negotiating a pay cut with your future self. Because that's exactly what you're doing, except your future self doesn't really have a say in the matter, do they? Imagine telling your future self, you need to work another 8 years because I want to shift my income forward a little bit. Eventually, you will become your future self, and you're not going to be very happy. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be asking me, okay, well, that sounds simple. Save up for stuff instead of financing it. But how do I go? How do I switch gears from financing a car, a $35,000 car, which is going to take me 7 years to pay off, and then save up $35,000, which will take me 5.5 years. That's 13 years, roughly, before I can get that next car. How do I do that? And some might say, well, do better maintenance on your vehicle. Sure. Well, you need to consider that maybe you shouldn't be looking at a $35,000 car yet. We need to start hating debt again. Thank you.